Well, thank you all. It's great to be here. Like I said earlier, my name is George Demiris, and I'm faculty in the School of Nursing, and I have a joint appointment in the School of Medicine in Biomedical Informatics. My own research has been focusing on the use of information technology to support older adults and their families in home care and hospice, and also looking at ways to use technology to facilitate aging in place. Today I'm going to be talking about telehealth in the home, which is a little bit more broad than the specialized examples I just mentioned, but I'm actually using some examples from my own work for some of the slides just to provide the examples and lessons learned from the field. With this lecture today, I'm hoping to just provide an overview of telehealth in the home and talk about what we know so far. What are some of the opportunities in the future as technologies become more sophisticated and perhaps more cost-effective, and also some of the challenges. And those challenges are not just the technical challenges, but also some of the ethical and clinical ones associated with doing this home monitoring. Like I said, I will be providing specific examples from my own work, but there's a lot of initiatives out there, and I'd be happy to also discuss other work, and I'm hopefully going to be addressing some of the lessons learned from different initiatives, primarily in the US. So I guess with that, I'll go ahead and start talking about what we're focusing on today. So we're talking about telehealth in the home, and telehealth is really broadly defined as the use of technology to bridge geographic distance. So you could use any type of technology to allow for people who are separated by geographic distance to communicate and exchange data. And those people could be a patient and a clinician, or two clinicians, or a patient talking to another patient as part of a support group. When we think about telehealth in the home, we're usually talking about patients at home using some type of technology to communicate with clinicians at a clinical site, at a home care agency, or at some other type of a health system site. And this has been around for a long time. But as we now see that technology becomes more and more widely used, we have pervasive ubiquitous computing, we have new technologies that are wearable, and more people adopt what's often referred to as consumer technologies, things that you can buy without having to get them prescribed from a clinician. So with this growth of technology, it's only natural that this will be affecting home healthcare as well. This is a field where the evidence has been growing and the literature around it has grown a lot. If you look, for example, on Medline, in 2003, there were only 556 indexed articles that focused on home care and technology. And in 2013, that number was more than double, 1,390 studies. So the body of literature in that space has been growing a lot, and more initiatives are introducing home telehealth. And we'll see that those technologies range from very simple things like a blood pressure cuff all the way to sensors and wearable technologies. When we think about home monitoring and telehealth in the home, one distinction that is often made in the literature is the one between active and passive monitoring, or active and passive technologies. Active technologies or active monitoring pertains to those systems that need to be initiated by a user. And there is a technology that needs to be operated by a user. So you're fully aware and choosing to be monitored, and you're deciding to use that device. For example, using a blood pressure cuff would be an example of active monitoring, because you can't really have that blood pressure assessed unless somebody's initiating the use of the blood pressure. They're wearing the cuff, they're pressing the button, they have to perhaps learn how to operate that device. Passive monitoring is when the technologies are used to have that monitoring be in the background. So as we'll see later in some examples, the kind of monitoring that becomes part of the residential infrastructure, like motion sensors or heat sensors or other types of technologies that measure things without anybody initiating their use, and more importantly, without anybody having to operate any new software or hardware, would be considered passive monitoring. The types of technologies that can be used for home monitoring have all kinds of functionalities. Most importantly, we are using technologies for physiological monitoring. And when you look at those two distinctions under active monitoring, there's a lot of commercially available systems that provide monitoring of vital signs through home telehealth units. Many units will have peripheral devices that will allow you to measure your blood pressure, your pulse oximetry, your weight, some also your glucose level, and so forth. So a user is using those devices to capture those vital signs, and then they get transmitted through a phone line or through the cloud to a central server so that your clinician or your home care agency can access those remotely. And similarly, there are technologies that facilitate passive monitoring for the purposes of physiological monitoring. For example, there's now bed sensors that you can put under the bed sheet that will measure respiration, restlessness at night, sleep interruptions. Those are passive monitoring because they're just there part of your bed and you don't have to really operate those. Another functionality that those types of technologies often have are for functional monitoring and detecting emergencies. So in the space of active monitoring, this would be the type of systems we see that are used, for example, for fall detection. And again, there are different types of technologies in that space, ranging from the bracelet or the something that you wear around your neck and you press a button when you've fallen, on the way to more sophisticated fall detection devices that have GPS and other sensors that kind of detect the fall without having the user have to press the button to notify somebody of the emergency. And in the passive monitoring space, where the user doesn't have to use any technology, there is more exploratory work in that space, and there's not as much mature commercially available systems, but there have been some what they call smart carpets or gate monitors that are supposed to study one's gait in their home and be able to detect when there's a fall or an abnormality. Some of those smart carpets are a combination of pressure and weight sensors under the carpet so that they can distinguish between somebody falling versus you dropped a book, for example. Other features include safety monitoring and assistance. So under active monitoring, this would be the types of alarm systems that detect those emergencies and allow you to communicate with a call center or a professional. And again, in the passive monitoring space, we have stove sensors as an example that will detect whether you're preparing a meal or you turned the stove on and you walked away, because they have a combination of a heat and a motion sensor. Then there's technologies around security monitoring and assistance. In active monitoring, you'll see many systems that require that you use some type of camera where you can remotely log in and monitor a certain residential space or how people are doing. And similarly, in the passive monitoring space, you'll have sensor systems that will detect how much time you're spending inside the home or outside, how many visitors you have, and so forth. There are things around social interaction, monitoring, and assistance. In active monitoring, we can include in that the plethora of social network platforms or other types of software that is allowed to allows patients to form, for example, peer-to-peer networks or self-help support groups and create social connectedness. And then in the sensor space, when you have passive monitoring, social interaction is often addressed by different sensors like door sensors or motion sensors that are supposed to trigger when there's a certain sign that indicates a decline or a trajectory that requires immediate attention. Let's say somebody is spending too much time inside the home, or the number of visitors has significantly decreased over time. And then finally, when we think about home technologies, there's several that have the functionality of cognitive and sensory assistance. Many devices or objects that are used as what's referred to as cognitive orthotics, allowing people to do something by supporting them through reminders or other types of cognitive assistance. This picture that you see here is in one such example. It's a device called the MD2 by Philips. It's a medication dispensing unit. The idea here is that a home care nurse will pre-program the unit with cups that will have the right medication at the right time, so that the patient will only have to take the dispensing cap when it's being dispensed, and there is a voice message that alerts them that they have to do so. And if you don't remove the cap that has been dispensed, then an alert is sent to the home care agency or to a clinician or to your family caregiver to let them know. Obviously, this is just one solution, and this works really well for homebound patients because this is not a portable unit. But there's other types of products out there that are supposed to help with medication reminders, for example, for people who need assistance or cognitive help when it comes to managing and maintaining really long, complex, sophisticated medication regimens. And in the passive monitoring space, again, this would be the kinds of solutions that have been developed to allow for things to happen to help you better do what you're planning on doing. So many systems now, and in many retirement communities, you'll see combination of motion sensors and lights, where if you wake up in the middle of the night, the lights will go on, will be turned on to help you find your way to the bathroom, for example. So helping you achieve a task by providing that extra sensory assistance. So home telehealth, as I mentioned earlier, has been something that has been around for many years. Actually, even in the 80s, we see some of the early home-based telehealth systems that use dial-up modems and really simple browsers, where you had what was called a web TV, a box that you would connect to your TV set, and you could do very simple data transmission. And since then, there's been many, many studies, most of them dealing with active monitoring and physiological monitoring. So the systems that have the blood pressure cuff, the weight scale, and other types of vital sign assessment tools. The literature has been growing, but in the early days, you saw a lot of the studies were primarily feasibility work, meaning we had small sample sizes, and the question was, can we even do it? What would people think about using technology in their home? Whereas in more recent times, you see larger studies, given that this is becoming more and more pervasive. But at times, the literature remains contradicting, and often the question is, well, why doesn't CMS, for example, provide reimbursement for all types of home telehealth services? And one of the challenges when it comes to the reimbursement question is that we don't necessarily have that solid evidence. I've mentioned here two citations that show how the findings sometimes do not align well. These are two studies. The first one by Stevenson et al. Was conducted in the UK, and it was a very large clinical trial looking at the power or the value of home telehealth for CHF and COPD patients. And in that study, they did find statistically significant and clinically significant improvements in terms of rehospitalization rates and overall clinical outcomes for patients in the telehealth group. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a study by Takahashi et al. That was conducted here in the United States in Rochester, Minnesota. And they also conducted a randomized clinical trial, also one of the more larger ones, with frail elderly, also looking at CHF and COPD. But here, the telehealth group didn't do so well. As a matter of fact, for really strange reasons, mortality increased, statistically significant increase of mortality for the telehealth patients. But again, this is a complex study, and I don't think the conclusion here is that telehealth is killing people. The idea behind that study is that perhaps the population of frail elderly was maybe not the right one, in that this study helped people identify other issues that they didn't have before, and it increased rehospitalization for that population, and many people then ended up in the hospital where they died. Those are just two examples to show you that when you do these types of studies, there is a lot of questions that arise, because we do know that allowing people to be in charge of their own care, be more involved, does lead to better symptom management, and does lead to people having higher knowledge of their disease, being more actively engaged, and having their family and themselves feel more empowered. So the question is not, should we allow people to monitor themselves at home, but rather what would be the structure of delivering telehealth services at home? When would we use a virtual visit to replace an actual visit, if we even want to consider that? Or how can it be used as a supplement to enhance traditional care? Some of the problems with the research studies as we review this literature is that in this space, technology developments are often more rapid than the research grant cycles. So in some cases, you have an idea for a research study, and it might take up to 2 years to have that funded, and then you have to conduct a 5-year clinical trial using the technology that you originally promised to use. So you may end up having to use the original modem-based or tablet-based intervention when the technology no longer exists or has since advanced. That happened a lot when people, for example, who had great ideas about portable PDAs to use in the home, and then the iPad came along and so many other things with smartphones came along, but you were stuck conducting a clinical trial for a few more years, testing an outdated technology. Another concept that makes the literature a little bit challenging in that space is that in many cases when we design a research study, we don't allow for the intervention to be tailored to the individual needs of people. Everybody has to be exposed to the same intervention. And that tailoring that is often prohibitive in research makes the study in some cases less generalizable. So for example, a lot of those home telehealth studies, in order to allow for everybody to be part of it, had eligibility criteria like you need to have wireless access at home, otherwise you can't participate in the study, or everybody has to have a landline and Wi-Fi. And those criteria make recruitment easier because it addresses your technology needs for your study, but those may not be representative of what the general population is actually accessing at their homes. For example, the requirement for landline, which is very common in those studies, is hard to meet nowadays when many people have been giving up their regular old phone and are using just a cell phone. So when we look at this body of literature with telehealth, there are some lessons learned. There's definitely great potential in terms of empowering patients, allowing them to monitor their own symptoms and their own condition. And in some cases, it works better than in others. I'm presenting some lessons learned from that, using examples from my own work that I think may help us think about the potential in the future for telehealth in the home. One of the lessons learned from the literature, I think, is that technology does not always need to be sophisticated to be effective. We really need to be addressing clinical questions and just find whatever technology may support that, rather than design interventions based on what technology can do. So in some cases, you don't really need sophisticated sensor-based or robotic technologies, and even a very simple tool could really be powerful in allowing you to deliver the care you already deliver, just in a more efficient or effective way. So one example from my own work that we found was in the home setting, but for hospice caregivers. This was a clinical trial we conducted to see if we could deliver problem-solving therapy for family caregivers, so the informal caregivers, family members, friends, or spouses who are taking care of a loved one at the end of life. And in that study, we wanted to see whether problem-solving therapy would be helpful. That's an intervention that has been delivered in many cases to caregivers of different populations. And in this study, we were randomly assigning people either to standard care or to a group that received problem-solving therapy in person, or a group that received that intervention via video. And we used a video conferencing system similar to Skype, although only a little bit more, supposedly more secure, have a higher level of encryption called VC. What we found in this study is that even with this really low-cost solution, where there was nothing high-tech about it other than using video conferencing that people now can use as a low-cost tool in their own computers, you are able to deliver interventions that in many cases in the past we thought couldn't be delivered over the regular phone. So problem-solving therapy is such an example where people contemplate and prioritize when addressing really complex emotional situations. And oftentimes people thought this cannot really be delivered over a regular phone with audio only, when you cannot interpret the non-verbal facial gestures and emotions, silence, and so forth. So by using the video platform in that case, you can actually deliver that same intervention that has been proven successful in other settings in a perhaps more cost-effective way. Because if each session is to last 30 minutes, agencies have a hard time adding yet another visit where they would be delivering just that intervention to family caregivers. With the use of technology, they can do that from their own office. Along the same lines, we use the same technology to allow caregivers in another intervention to participate in the interdisciplinary team meetings that hospice agencies have every other week. Those are federally mandated, and in those meetings, all the cases are being discussed. Theoretically, those are open to patients and families, but in reality, given that each case is maybe discussed for 5 minutes, and there's large geographic distances and frailty of the patients, nobody attends those in person. So by just using, again, simple low-cost video conferencing, we were able to bring in the caregivers, and in some cases the patients, if they were able to, into the conference and have them interact with the hospice team virtually through the video conferencing piece. That intervention was proven very successful, and caregivers talked about being able to see the medical director for the first time. This is a person they often don't get to actually meet in person because they don't see them at home, but also be able to express some concerns they had around pain management and have the whole team listen to those concerns. So again, this would be not a high-tech solution, but it would be something that could be considered as telehealth in the home, addressing in this case not the physiological aspects of monitoring, but more so the communication aspects. So with the new technologies that we have a lot of opportunities to capture what we already have captured more efficiently. For example, blood pressure or weight are things in the past that we had also measured, but we had to rely on the nurse visiting at home to have those assessments. And now we can ask people to measure what we always measure more efficiently, more frequently on their own. But the technologies have also allowed us now to capture new knowledge and data that we were not capturing before. And with these opportunities come new challenges as to how can we make most use of these new types of data. So I already mentioned that there's different sensors that can be used in the home. And a lot of those sensor solutions are basically collecting a lot of data with a goal to better understand how people are engaging in activities of daily living. There's stove sensors, sensor mats, motion sensors, HydroSense and ElectroSense are sensors that provide detailed information about electricity and water consumption. The idea with all the smart home sensors is not just to collect the data because we can, or just to figure out what are people doing every day in their home, but rather to detect those patterns or trajectories that indicate some abnormality or deviation from what would be considered normal for that resident. In other words, we don't really care that much if a person woke up at 6 a.m. one specific morning, but it's more interesting to know that the person seems to be spending more and more time in bed, or that they used to walk around a lot and now they're showing sedentary behavior, sitting for 10 hours straight, or that they are giving up on personal hygiene and meal preparation, or they're spending more time outside the home after midnight. I'm just using extreme examples to demonstrate the kind of information that would be of value, meaning we're not really interested in the discrete events, what's happening every day. We're interested in what seems to be an abnormality that could be allowing us to prevent an adverse event. So there are a lot of commercially available systems that will give you the opportunity to install various sensors around the home. Many of them target specifically older adults, and they'll have a portal for family members to be able to log in remotely and see how their loved one is doing. Again, the challenge here is to make sense of this data and make sure that we have the right algorithms to extract information and make inferences about activities of daily living that are accurate, but more importantly, help us really make sense and intervene when it's appropriate. So when I talked about being able to get new sleep data, with all these technologies, we now have new information that we didn't have available to us before. For example, information around sleep quality. In the past, if you wanted to have data about how people slept, you either had to bring people into a sleep lab to do a sleep study, or you had to rely on a sleep diary where people will fill out every day how well they slept. And as we all know, this type of subjective reporting has a lot of issues around bias and over and under reporting. Now, even with a Fitbit, people have data that may not be completely accurate or completely comprehensive when it comes to assessing sleep quality, but it's definitely objective data around time spent in bed, times you get out of bed, and even restlessness during the night. You have objective numbers of bathroom visits with motion sensors and no longer asking people to recall for the last month or 2 months how often they went to the bathroom or how restless they were. Again, we have now objective or accurate data around sedentary behavior rather than asking people if they feel that they're not moving around much. We can get all this information as well as information around hygiene and meal preparation. So by having all this new data, we could potentially rethink the algorithms we use for decision making. We all know, for example, that sleep is really important, but the reason why we have never really used that variable in the day-to-day decision making was that we didn't have the accurate data in that space. And now by having all this behavioral sensing information, we could perhaps get a better understanding of what's going on in the home, and also perhaps identifying areas where patients and families may need assistance or intervention, where in the past we would have to wait for a catastrophic event to really realize that there was perhaps an issue with one or more of those activities of daily living. Thank you. Then we have to think about the challenge of interface design. And what I mean by that is that by collecting all this data, we have powerful information, but in order to make this information make sense to the different stakeholders, we need to figure out ways to present and visualize the data in such a way that meets their information needs. Here's another example from a study we did where we used a telehealth kiosk in a retirement community. And again, here people could swipe their card and enter information about themselves for their login into their own profile. And the telehealth kiosk had peripheral devices so they could measure their blood pressure, their weight, and so forth. So people were able to use this, even people who had some hearing impairment and cognitive decline. And overall, people liked being engaged and measuring all those parameters about their own well-being. But the challenge was to then convey that information back to people so that it made sense to them. This is just an example of the interfaces that we ended up developing. And this was challenging in that people had different expectations as to what they wanted to see in their personal wellness record, and the visualization needs that patients had were very different from clinicians who didn't need the day-to-day reporting and just wanted to see aggregate data. Patients wanted to be able to annotate day-to-day report and have elements of comparison of how well they're doing compared to others in their community or people in their age group. And then finally, when we talk about introducing technology in the home, we really need to focus on understanding acceptance. And what I mean by that is not just the general satisfaction question. A lot of home telehealth studies have assessed satisfaction by asking people, are you satisfied with the system? And they report 99% satisfaction. But the challenge is to understand what people's real perceptions are and what may or may not be considered as undesirable to individual people. So in this context, I propose the term obtrusiveness, which we've defined as the summary evaluation by the user based on what features of the technology they may be perceiving as undesirable and prominent. And this goes beyond just the privacy issue, which, however, is one of the most important things to address when thinking about introducing new technologies in people's homes. So in this framework we developed around intrusiveness, we're really highlighting aspects like the privacy dimension, which is important, but also things like the physical dimension. What does the technology look like? How is it installed in what space? Is it aesthetically pleasing, or is it creating barriers for people? Then there is the issue of usability. When we ask people to operate technology, is it really user-friendly and easy to use? How does the equipment work, and is it perceived to be reliable and effective? Does the technology affect human interactions? One of the concerns sometimes that people bring up in home telehealth is that they're worried that this type of remote monitoring will lead to fewer interactions with their clinicians, or that the nurse will visit fewer times because some visits will be replaced by virtual visits. There's a question as to how you perceive yourself in an environment that's a high-tech monitoring environment, and how this may also affect your daily living and visitors you may have at home, and also how to sustain this and how to keep using the technology over time, especially even as people's functional ability may decrease.
Great.